Imagine the heat of the day finally lifting off the sand, the way it does the moment the sun drops below the horizon in the desert, leaving behind an air so clear and so cool it feels almost like a different substance entirely from the thick, shimmering heat of the afternoon. You're standing in the courtyard of a caravanserai somewhere along the Silk Road, perhaps in Central Asia, perhaps closer to the Persian plateau, 1,000 years ago, give or take a few centuries. Around you, camels kneel heavily in the dust, their loads already lifted from their backs and stacked carefully nearby. A fire is being built at the centre of the courtyard, and the first stars are already beginning to prick through a sky that will, within another hour, hold more stars than most people who have never crossed a true desert have ever seen gathered in one place. This is a caravanserai, a fortified roadside inn built specifically to shelter merchants, travellers and their animals along the great overland trade routes connecting China to the Mediterranean. Routes that carried not only silk, though silk gave the whole network its most famous name, but spices, gems, paper, glass, ideas, religions and languages, across a distance that could take the better part of a year to travel from one end to the other. A traveller arriving at a stop like this one, after a long hard day's crossing through open, exposed desert, found here something genuinely precious. Walls thick enough to keep out both weather and bandits. Water, and, just as importantly, the company of other travellers gathered from an extraordinary range of different homelands, all of them, for one night at least, sharing the same fire and the same wide star-filled desert skiing. Tonight, we're going to sit at that fire together. We'll listen to the particular sounds of a caravan settling in for the night. We'll learn what it actually took to keep a network of merchants and travellers safely moving across some of the most difficult terrain on Earth. And we'll drift, slowly, towards sleep the way a genuinely exhausted traveller drifted towards sleep after a day spent crossing open desert under a punishing sun. So let your own body settle now, the way theirs settled once the fire had caught and the tea had been poured, and let's step together into the cool, star-scattered dark of a Silk Road night. Before we settle fully into this particular evening, it's worth understanding just how genuinely vast and how genuinely significant the network of routes we now call the Silk Road actually was, because no single traveller in this whole story would ever have crossed its entire length. And understanding that helps explain exactly why places like the caravanserai we're sitting in tonight mattered so enormously to the entire system's continued function. The Silk Road was never a single road in the way we might picture a modern highway, but rather a vast, shifting network of overland routes, stretching across an enormous distance from China in the east, through Central Asia, Persia and the Middle East, eventually connecting to the Mediterranean world, and, from there, into Europe itself. Goods very rarely travelled this entire distance in the hands of a single merchant or a single caravan. Instead, the trade moved in stages, a merchant carrying goods a particular stretch of the route before selling them on to another trader, who would carry them the next stage, and so on, across dozens of hands and dozens of separate journeys, before a length of silk woven in a Chinese workshop might eventually find its way onto the back of a wealthy Roman senator, most of the people involved in that long chain of exchange never knowing, or even particularly needing to know, exactly where the goods they carried had originally come from, or where they would eventually end their journey. This staged, relay-like structure of trade meant that the physical infrastructure supporting it, the wells, the fortified stopping points, the caravanserais like the one we're sitting in tonight, mattered enormously to the entire system's continued function. since a traveller crossing even a single stage of this vast network faced genuine, serious danger from weather, terrain, and banditry, and needed reliable, regularly spaced points of shelter, water, and rest to make the crossing survivable at all. Rulers and merchant guilds across the many different kingdoms and empires this network passed through understood this clearly, and the construction and maintenance of caravanserais, spaced at roughly a single day's travel apart along the most heavily used routes, represented a genuinely significant sustained investment by local authorities who understood how directly their own prosperity depended on this trade continuing to move safely and reliably through their territory. Beyond the physical goods themselves, silk, yes, but also spices, precious stones, ceramics, glassware, and an enormous range of other valuable trade goods. This network carried something arguably even more significant across its vast distance. Ideas, religious beliefs, artistic techniques, and knowledge of every kind, moving alongside the merchandise in the minds and conversations of the travellers who carried it. Buddhism spread eastward along exactly these routes, from its origins in South Asia into Central Asia and eventually China. Paper-making technology travelled westward from China, eventually reaching the Islamic world, and from there, Europe itself. And the caravanserai we're sitting in tonight, however modest and however far from any of the great centres of civilization this particular network connected, served as a genuine, if small, node within this whole vast, continent-spanning exchange of goods and ideas alike. Let's return now to the specific evening we've begun, and to the particular experience of a caravan actually arriving at one of these fortified way stations after a long day's difficult travel, because the relief and the careful, practiced ritual of this arrival tells us a great deal about how genuinely essential these stops were to the whole system of long-distance overland trade. A caravanserai's basic architecture followed a broadly consistent pattern across an enormous geographic range, reflecting exactly the practical needs it was built to serve. A single, strong gateway, large enough to admit loaded camels but narrow enough to be easily defended or closed against attack, led into a central open courtyard, around which ranged storage rooms for goods, stabling for animals, and simple sleeping quarters for the travellers themselves. The whole structure typically built from thick mud brick or stone walls, specifically designed to provide real defence against both weather and banditry alike. A well or cistern, providing the single most essential resource any desert traveller required, sat at or near the centre of this courtyard, its water carefully managed and, in the most well-run establishments, kept genuinely clean and reliably available, regardless of how heavily the current season's traffic happened to be running. The arrival process itself followed its own familiar practiced rhythm, repeated by caravan after caravan across countless individual nights just like this one. Camels were led in through the gateway and gradually unloaded, their heavy packs of goods, silk, spices, precious metals, carefully stacked and secured within the caravanserai's storage areas, watched over in the more substantial establishments by dedicated guards employed specifically for this purpose. The animals themselves, having carried their considerable loads across genuinely difficult terrain since well before dawn, were watered, fed, and allowed to rest. Camels in particular requiring real, careful attention after a long crossing. Their feet checked for injury, their overall condition assessed by handlers whose accumulated practical knowledge of these animals' particular needs represented its own genuine valuable craft skill. The caravanserais keeper, or whoever held responsibility for the establishment's daily operation, would greet arriving merchants, arrange for their lodging and their goods' safe storage, and, in the more substantial and more strategically positioned stops along the route, offer additional services travellers genuinely needed. Currency exchange between the many different coinages circulating across this vast, multicultural trading network, basic repairs to damaged equipment or worn harness, and, crucially, current information about the road ahead, weather conditions, reports of banditry, the state of wells and water sources further along the route, information that could genuinely mean the difference between a safe onward journey and real disaster for whichever caravan happened to be setting out the following morning. Let's move now toward the fire itself, because the evening gathering around a caravanserai's central courtyard fire represented one of the most genuinely distinctive and, in its own way, one of the most remarkable social experiences this whole vast trading network regularly produced, an evening spent in the close company of strangers drawn from an extraordinary range of different homelands, languages and cultures, all sharing, for this one night, the same fire and the same food. A single caravanserai on any given evening might shelter travellers from a genuinely remarkable range of backgrounds. Persian and Sogdian merchants, whose particular expertise in exactly this kind of long-distance overland trade made them some of the most significant and most widely travelled merchant communities anywhere along the entire route. Chinese traders, Arab and Jewish merchants whose own trading networks connected deep into the Mediterranean and Middle Eastern world, and travellers of every other description besides, pilgrims, diplomats, scholars, and adventurers drawn to the road for reasons that had nothing to do with trade at all. This genuine, remarkable diversity meant that an evening's fireside conversation, where language allowed it, and trade routes of this kind produced their own genuine, practical multilingualism among merchants who regularly needed to communicate across exactly these kinds of linguistic boundaries, could range across an extraordinary breadth of subjects. News from distant capitals, stories of the road ahead and the road already travelled, and the kind of easy, practical exchange of accumulated travellers' wisdom that made every subsequent journey along this same route just a little bit safer and a little bit better prepared. Hospitality along the Silk Road carried its own genuine, deeply held cultural weight across nearly every tradition this network connected. A guest, once received and fed, understood across an enormous range of the specific cultures involved to be owed real, serious protection and courtesy for the duration of their stay, regardless of their particular origin or their particular faith. This shared cultural value, however differently it was specifically expressed across the many different traditions represented at any given caravanserai's evening fire, meant that the courtyard we're sitting in tonight functioned as a genuine, if temporary, neutral ground. Merchants who might, under other circumstances, have been genuine commercial rivals sharing the same meal and the same fire with real, if practical, courtesy and goodwill. Food shared around this fire reflected this same remarkable cultural blending. A caravanserai's kitchen, where one existed, very often preparing simple, hearty dishes designed to satisfy travellers from many different dietary traditions at once. Bread, rice and stewed meat or vegetables forming a common, broadly acceptable foundation, while individual travellers frequently supplemented this shared fare with their own particular provisions, carried from home, dried fruits, spices, and specific preserved foods that reflected their own specific regional cuisine, offered around and shared in the easy, practical spirit of the road among fellow travellers who had, for this one night, become genuine, if temporary, companions. Just as we discussed aboard a medieval ship's careful, rotating night watches, and within an alpine monastery's disciplined attention to travellers moving through dangerous weather, a caravanserai's own security through the night hours required real, careful, disciplined attention and understanding. This watch tells us a great deal about just how genuinely valuable and how genuinely vulnerable the goods gathered within these walls actually were. Banditry represented a real, ongoing danger across significant stretches of the Silk Road's vast length, and the goods gathered within any single caravanserai on any given night, silk, precious stones, spices, and often substantial quantities of gold and silver coin used to facilitate the trade itself, represented a genuinely tempting target for anyone willing to risk an attack. Caravanserais built specifically with this danger in mind, their thick outer walls and single, easily defended gateway offering real, practical protection, and larger, more strategically important establishments along the busier stretches of the route very often maintain their own dedicated guard force, sometimes provided directly by whichever local ruler or authority had built and maintained the structure, understanding, as we discussed earlier this evening, how directly their own prosperity depended on this trade continuing to move safely through their territory. Individual caravans too, particularly the larger and more valuable ones, very often travelled with their own hired guards, experienced men familiar with the specific dangers of the particular stretch of road being crossed, and these guards maintained their own careful watch through the night, even within the relative safety of a fortified caravanserai's walls. A discipline of vigilance that had, for men who made this dangerous crossing their genuine livelihood, become as natural and unremarkable as breathing. A guard on watch through the deep hours of a caravanserai night listened for exactly the kinds of sounds that might indicate trouble. An unfamiliar voice at the gate, unusual movement among the animals, anything that broke the ordinary settled rhythm of a courtyard full of travellers and merchants genuinely at rest. This careful watch extended too to the practical management of the fire itself and the animals' overnight care, camels requiring real ongoing attention through the night, particularly during the coldest months when desert temperatures could drop dramatically once the sun had fully set. A genuinely striking contrast to the punishing heat of the same location's daytime hours that surprised many travellers unfamiliar with exactly how extreme this particular kind of desert climate swing could be. Handlers familiar with these animals' particular needs checked on them periodically through the night, adjusting their coverings against the cold, ensuring their water remained accessible, one more thread in the same overall pattern of careful, disciplined nighttime vigilance that kept this whole, remarkable, continent-spanning system of trade and travel functioning safely, one caravanserai and one careful night's watch at a time. Let's lift our eyes now, the way a traveller along this route very often genuinely did, toward the sky itself, because navigation across the vast, often genuinely featureless stretches of desert this network crossed depended in real and essential ways on exactly the kind of careful, accumulated, astronomical knowledge we've touched on in earlier evenings together. adapted here to the specific, demanding needs of desert travel. Experienced caravan guides whose accumulated knowledge of the route represented a genuinely valuable, carefully protected professional skill relied on the stars for navigation across stretches of open desert where no obvious landmark offered reliable guidance. The position of particular stars and constellations at specific times of night, providing a genuinely reliable method of maintaining a caravan's proper direction across terrain that could otherwise disorient even an experienced traveller with remarkable speed and ease. This stellar knowledge worked alongside a whole additional body of accumulated practical desert skill. The reading of sand formations shaped by prevailing winds, the recognition of specific, reliable landmark features, distinctive rock formations, the particular shape of a distant dune that an experienced guide had learned to recognize across years of repeated travel along this same familiar stretch of road. The clarity of a genuine desert night sky, largely undimmed by the moisture and dust that softened stellar visibility across so much of the more temperate, more humid landscapes this show has visited in earlier evenings, offered travellers along this route a genuinely spectacular view of the stars, a depth and density of visible constellation that surprised and genuinely moved many travellers whose own accounts of the journey survive to us today, describing the desert night sky with real, evident wonder, a sense of the sky's vastness and clarity that few other environments on Earth could quite match. This particular quality of the desert sky carried real practical value for exactly the kind of careful nighttime navigation we've just discussed, but it also carried, for many travellers, a genuine spiritual and aesthetic significance beyond its purely practical use, a sense of smallness and wonder before a genuinely vast, star-filled darkness that appears again and again in surviving travellers' accounts and poetry from across the many different cultures this network connected. Merchants and travellers making this journey very often carried their own particular traditions and beliefs regarding the desert night and its dangers, echoing in their own specific cultural form the same underlying human instinct toward protective ritual and careful respect for a genuinely dangerous, unpredictable landscape that we've traced across every single culture this show has explored together. Certain stretches of particularly difficult or dangerous desert acquired their own local reputation among experienced travellers, requiring particular caution, particular timing, or particular protective practice to cross safely. Knowledge passed down, guide to apprentice. The same patient way every other essential piece of practical survival knowledge in this whole show's many evenings together has been passed down, from one generation's hard-won experience to the next's careful, attentive learning. Let's settle back down now, from the vast sky above to the more immediate, more intimate comfort of the fire itself, because the specific rituals surrounding rest and refreshment at a stop like this one carried their own genuine cultural weight and their own genuine, deeply felt comfort for travellers who had, in many cases, been crossing difficult, exhausting terrain for weeks or even months at a stretch. Tea, in the specific regions where this custom held particular cultural importance, played a genuinely significant role in the evening ritual of arrival and rest, prepared and shared communally around the fire in a practice that carried real social as well as simply physical restorative value. The careful, familiar preparation of tea offering travellers a genuine welcome moment of ordinary domestic ritual amid the otherwise thoroughly unfamiliar, thoroughly demanding rhythm of long-distance desert travel. This small, familiar ritual performed and shared the same essential way, regardless of which particular stop along the vast network a given evening happened to find a traveller resting at, offered a genuine thread of continuity and comfort across an otherwise constantly shifting landscape of new faces, new languages, and new terrain. Rest itself, for travellers who had spent the day's hardest hours crossing genuinely difficult, exposed terrain under a punishing sun, carried its own particular, deeply felt physical relief once a caravanserie's walls finally offered real shelter and real safety for the night. Sleeping arrangements varied considerably by the specific establishment's size and by a traveller's own means, wealthier merchants sometimes securing a small private room for themselves and their most valuable goods, while many travellers simply spread their own bedding within the shared courtyard, or under whatever covered arcade the structure's architecture provided, close enough to their own animals and their own goods to keep a watchful, practiced eye on both, even while genuinely, deeply asleep. The particular physical exhaustion of a long day's desert crossing produced for most travellers a genuinely deep and immediate sleep once the evening's fire had finally burned low, and the courtyard's conversation had gradually softened into silence. Bodies that had spent the day's hardest hours swaying atop a heavily loaded camel, or walking alongside one across genuinely difficult shifting sand, finding real, welcome rest in whatever bedding the night afforded them, the desert's own dramatic cooling once the sun had fully set offering, in its own way, a genuinely comfortable sleeping temperature after the punishing heat of the day just concluded. Let's spend a little more time before we let this particular evening finally draw toward its own close, considering the specific remarkable goods gathered and stored within this caravanserie's walls tonight, because understanding exactly what moved along this network helps us appreciate just how genuinely significant and how genuinely valuable an evening's safe rest at a stop like this one actually was. Silk, the good that gave this entire vast network its most enduring name, travelled westward from China in genuinely enormous quantities. Across the many centuries this trade route remained active, prized across the entire span of its journey for a quality and a technique of production that remained, for a very long stretch of this trade's history, a genuinely closely guarded secret within China itself, adding real additional value and real additional mystique to every bolt that made its way successfully across this whole long, difficult journey. Spices, too, moved in real quantity along significant stretches of this network, though the specific routes carrying the greatest volume of spice trade shifted over time and often ran at least partly by sea, rather than purely overland pepper, cinnamon, and other genuinely valuable seasonings commanding real, significant prices by the time they reach their most distant markets. A direct, tangible reflection of just how long and how difficult a journey they had actually travelled to arrive there. Beyond silk and spice, this network carried an enormous additional range of valuable goods, precious stones and metals, fine ceramics and glassware, paper, once its production technique had begun spreading westward from its Chinese origins, and, in the other direction, wool, glassware of a different regional style, and a whole further range of goods specifically valued within the markets this vast network connected. And, as we touched on earlier this evening, the network carried something beyond simple physical merchandise as well. Religious texts and religious teachers moving alongside the trade goods, artistic techniques and styles spreading and blending across an enormous geographic range as craftsmen in one region encountered and absorbed influences carried by travellers and traders from another, a knowledge of every practical kind, agricultural techniques, medical practices, mathematical and astronomical learning, moving steadily along this same long chain of relay-style exchange, one caravanserai and one evening's fireside conversation at a time. The goods resting quietly within this particular caravanserai's storage rooms tonight, then, represented far more than their simple monetary value alone, however considerable that value genuinely was. They represented an entire vast continent-spanning system of human connection and exchange, built and maintained across centuries through exactly the kind of careful, patient, cooperative effort we've traced across every single culture this whole show has visited together, travellers and merchants and caravans, right keepers alike, each contributing their own small essential piece toward keeping this whole remarkable network safely, reliably functioning. Let's sit now, for a while longer, simply in the particular quality of quiet that settles over a desert caravanserai once the evening's conversation has finally softened into silence and the fire has burned down to its own low, steady glow. Because this particular quiet carries its own distinct, memorable character, genuinely different from the quiet we've settled into during every other evening this show has spent together. The desert itself, once full darkness, has properly settled, and the wind, if any stirred through the heat of the day, has typically calmed considerably with the cooling night air, holds an extraordinarily complete, extraordinarily deep silence, broken only by the occasional soft sound of a settled camel shifting its weight, or the low, quiet murmur of a guard's voice exchanging a few words with whoever has come to relieve his watch. This silence, layered beneath a sky holding more visible stars than most people encounter anywhere else in their entire lives, produces a genuinely distinct, genuinely memorable atmosphere, one that surviving travellers' accounts describe again and again with real, evident wonder, a sense of vastness and stillness that few other environments on this whole show's many evenings together have quite matched. Within the caravanserai's own walls, this vast outer silence settles into something slightly warmer, slightly more intimate, the last embers of the courtyard fire glowing low, the soft, settled breathing of dozens of exhausted travellers finally, genuinely at rest after a long day's difficult crossing, animals shifting occasionally in their own contented, settled sleep nearby. This particular blend, vast desert silence beyond the walls, warm, settled human rest within them, produces exactly the kind of deep, genuine peace that made these caravanserai stops so genuinely valued across the whole long history of this remarkable trading network, a nightly, reliable island of real safety and real rest within an otherwise genuinely demanding, genuinely dangerous journey. There is something worth carrying with you as your own eyes grow heavy tonight about how completely these travellers, drawn from so many different homelands and so many different lives, found genuine common rest together within these same walls, night after night, across centuries of exactly this same patient, careful pattern of travel and shelter. Whatever separated them by daylight, language, faith, homeland, the particular goods they carried and the particular markets they were bound for, the desert night itself, and the shared, simple comfort of a fire and a safe wall against the dark, drew them together into exactly the same quiet, grateful rest. Just as we've traced across every single culture this show has visited together, from a medieval cottage's careful threshold rituals to a Roman farmhouse's household gods, travellers along the Silk Road carried their own rich, varied body of protective custom, shaped by the genuine, considerable dangers of the journey and by the remarkable diversity of religious and cultural traditions this network connected. Merchants making this journey very often carried small protective charms or amulets specific to their own particular religious or cultural tradition, tucked into clothing or attached to a caravan's own equipment, invoking whatever protective figure or belief their own background considered most reliable against the specific dangers of the road, banditry, disease, the genuine physical hazard of the crossing itself. Buddhist travellers might carry small protective texts or images, their safe passage entrusted to the same careful devotional practice that governed a monk's own daily religious life. Muslim merchants, an enormously significant presence along significant stretches of this network, particularly following the spread of Islam across Central Asia and the Middle East, might recite specific prayers before setting out on a particularly dangerous stretch of road, entrusting their safety to the same deep faith that shaped nearly every other aspect of their daily life. And travellers from the many other religious traditions this remarkable network connected, Zoroastrian, Nestorian, Christian, and various regional folk traditions besides, carried forward their own particular versions of this same underlying human instinct, meeting a genuinely uncertain, genuinely dangerous journey with whatever specific protective practice their own tradition offered. Certain locations along the route acquired their own particular reputation among experienced travellers, echoing in their own specific desert and mountain context. The same body of cautionary local folklore we discussed surrounding certain stretches of medieval road and certain difficult alpine passes in earlier evenings together. A particular stretch of desert known for sudden, violent sandstorms, or a mountain pass with a history of bandit activity, accumulated its own careful reputation, past guide to apprentice across generations of exactly this same kind of patient, practical knowledge transmission, alongside whatever specific protective custom local tradition associated with safely crossing it. Some travellers' accounts describe genuine, widely held beliefs regarding strange sounds and phenomena encountered in certain remote stretches of desert, voices or music heard with no visible source, understood by many travellers as the activity of spirits or jinn believed to inhabit these remote, difficult landscapes, a belief that finds real, genuine echo in the alpine folklore we discussed surrounding certain mountain passes. Two entirely distinct traditions, separated by enormous geographic distance, arriving at remarkably similar explanations for the genuine, uncanny strangeness of sound and light in a remote, difficult wilderness landscape. Caravanserais themselves, and the specific rituals surrounding a caravan's departure from one each morning, carried their own layer of protective custom, a prayer offered, a specific auspicious time of departure observed where local tradition held this mattered, small offerings or gestures of respect made toward whatever local shrine, or landmark held particular significance to travellers following this specific stretch of road. This blending of practical travel wisdom, careful route knowledge, awareness of water sources and weather patterns, with genuine religious and protective custom, mirrors, in its own specific desert context, exactly the same seamless blending we've traced across every other culture. And every other evening this show has explored together practical skill and spiritual practice woven so thoroughly into a single, unified approach to an uncertain, demanding world that the travellers themselves, much like the medieval villagers and Roman farmers and Egyptian mothers we've spent so many evenings alongside, would very likely never have thought to separate the two at all. So let the fire in that caravanserai courtyard burn down all the way now, its last embers glowing low and steady beneath a sky still thick with more stars than any single evening could ever properly count. Let the camels settle fully into their own patient, kneeling rest, their loads safely stored, their long day's crossing finally, genuinely behind them. Let the guard on watch continue his own quiet, patient rounds along the walls, exactly as guards have kept this same watch across countless nights just like this one, stretching back across centuries of this same remarkable, continent-spanning road. You don't need to rise before dawn tomorrow, the way this whole courtyard of travellers will, to load the animals and set out once again across the open desert ahead. Tonight, at least, you are sheltered and safe and warm within walls built specifically, carefully for exactly this purpose, to give a tired traveller exactly this kind of rest before the road calls them forward again. If this quiet night beneath the desert stars helped carry you towards sleep, you're welcome to leave a gentle tap of a thumb before your own eyes close the rest of the way, and let us know in the comments which old road or which old world you'd like us to travel toward next. And if you'd like to keep returning to nights like this one, consider following the show so the next fire is already lit and waiting for you whenever you're ready to rest here again. For now, though, none of that needs to happen yet. There is only the deep, patient quiet of the desert night, and the last low glow of the courtyard fire, and the old, old feeling, carried across centuries of travellers from 100 different homelands, resting together beneath this same wide sky, that you're sheltered and welcomed and safe until the road calls you forward once more. Rest now. The stars are keeping their own watch above you. Morning and the road will come on their own, the way they always have.